Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm here with Sean Zay, who will be presenting on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action and providing an update. So I will pass it over to Sean Zay. And again, thank you so much. If you want to attend any of our future CLEs, they are posted on the website.
Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time to spend your lunch with me. I just want to give you some information about a symposium that I attended recently in Toronto. I'm going to take you through a few slides, talk a little bit about it, and then I want to open it up for questions. And I'd really encourage you throughout, if you have any questions, any comments, feel free to unmute and just jump in there. And apologies, I am getting over a cold, so if I cough or my voice starts to disappear in between, I hope you'll bear with me. So January 30th and 31st in Toronto, the Law Society of Ontario hosted a symposium where they gathered both Indigenous and non-Indigenous legal academics, practitioners, community leaders, and regulators from across the country. And the focus on the symposium was to discuss 3 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to actions. Now, this is the first national symposium of its kind that's been held in the 10 years since the report was initially released. And just as a refresher, or in case anyone's not as familiar, I'll give a little bit of background on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So the TRC, as it's often referred to, occurred from 2008 to 2015. This was something that was created out of what was called the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement. And the purpose of the TRC was to acknowledge Canada's role in supporting residential schools and the horrific impact that that's had on Indigenous communities and the lasting legacy of them as well. And the really great thing that came out of the TRC was in its summary of reports and findings, there were 94 calls to action that were created as well. And these were divided into legacy and reconciliation. The purpose being that we can acknowledge the TRC is able to acknowledge the negative impact that residential schools have had, but how do we move forward? How do we now fix what has been broken? And so the purpose of the symposium was to reflect on these 3 calls to action and to make a plan for moving forward together as a legal community. There are a number of calls to action that are relevant to the legal community, but these 3 in particular, I think. So the first was number 27, which I have up for you on the screen there. We call upon the Federation of Law Societies of Canada to ensure that lawyers receive appropriate cultural competency training, which includes the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal-Crown relations. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. So this one, of course, is specifically a call out to the law societies, asking us to bring in different types of training, and a reminder that this came out in 2015. The next one is TRC Call to Action number 28. We call upon law schools in Canada to require all law students to take a course in Aboriginal people and the law, which includes the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal-Crown relations. This will require skill-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. So the language of number 28 really reflects number 27 as well. The main difference there is that whereas that one is speaking to regulators and law societies, here we're specifically asking the law schools to play a role in this. And finally, number 50. In keeping with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we call upon the federal government, in collaboration with Aboriginal organizations, to fund the establishment of Indigenous law institutes for the development, use, and understanding of Indigenous laws and access to justice in accordance with the unique cultures of Aboriginal peoples in Canada. And so this one is then the call out on a broader scale to the government specifically, and it's asking for funding for Indigenous law institutes, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is something that I think Nunavut has done a bit better than some other jurisdictions. So a lot came out of this symposium, of course. It was 2 days really just focusing on what has been done, what should have been done. And I will say that something that was really great about the symposium was everyone approached it from a place of, we can be doing better. We've done some things, but we need to be doing a lot better than what we have done so far. And so people were really open in self-identifying a lot of the mistakes that they've made, a lot of the gaps that they have in their jurisdictions. And that really allowed us to come together in a place of creating a plan for moving forward. So there's a lot of themes that came out of this. We did spend some time discussing to the federal law society's work to update the national requirements on the TRC's call to action. One of the main ways in which this is happening is that licensing candidates who have studied outside of Canada, when they come to Canada now, one of the requirements will be a course that talks about duties to Indigenous person, Indigenous history, that sort of thing. And I believe a note was shared with you on the registration page that talks a bit more about that, but happy to discuss that as well. But because we don't have too much time together this afternoon, I don't want to take up the entirety of your lunch hour. I really want to focus on 3 themes that came up over those 2 days. So the first was the importance of mandating legal education. There have been a lot of discussions around the importance of creating legal education around Indigenous persons and the importance of offering these courses. But a theme that kept coming up over and over again was that these courses need to be mandated. It's not enough for them to be offered. It needs to be a requirement for people to take them. And the conference was opened by the Honorable Justice Gerald Morin of the Saskatchewan Provincial Court. He's also a member of the Cree Nation. He spoke a lot about our duty to learn. And I think it's important to focus on this framing of our duty to learn. Because if we have a duty to learn about Indigenous rights, about Indigenous history, about the way our legal community can better serve Indigenous persons, then it's not something that's optional. It's something that's required upon us. So one of the issues we come up against when we have these discussions, though, is there a way to not make it mandatory and to still fulfill that duty? If we make learning optional, are we fulfilling our duty to learn? Or are we just offsetting the duty onto individuals, making each individual make that decision on, should I learn or should I not learn? Is this something I'm going to access or not access? But on the flip side, the other problem with that is it productive to force people to learn when they insist they have no interest in learning? And this is something that I think we're oftentimes afraid to openly discuss or afraid to really call out, is that we're not all approaching this as a legal community from a place of, we want to do better for our Indigenous colleagues and for Indigenous persons that we're serving. There are a lot of individuals in our community who either do not care or hold very racist viewpoints, who do not want to dedicate any of their time to these kind of programming. And so something we really have to consider, and something we really have to figure out a workaround to, is how do we address that? How do we bring these people into the fold? If they're forced to take these courses, is that something that's going to have a positive impact on them? Is it going to change viewpoints? And where we kind of landed at the symposium is that there is no way in which forcing individuals to take these courses is going to have a negative impact on Indigenous communities as we see it. But there is a possibility for a positive impact. There is a possibility for bridging of gaps and for better understanding. And so it's really something, I think by the end of the symposium, we didn't have any individual advocating that these courses should be optional. Everyone was saying that these are mandatory courses. And another thing that came out was that these courses, the leadership on them really must come from law societies. This is a spot in which it's very easy for regulators to come out and say, this is something that is a requirement, and if you have not fulfilled this requirement, your membership in the law society will not be valid. It is a bit more difficult if you put the onus onto workplaces or even onto individual law schools. There is a role there as well, but it's possible for people to fall through the gaps. And so I'm interested in hearing if anyone in the group who's online right now has any thoughts on this. If there's anyone who believes that it should not be mandatory, or if there's anyone who thinks we need more mandatory courses, happy to hear. Nobody? Something to think about if you have thoughts later on. I'd really love to hear those as well. I think in Nunavut, we're in a unique position because all of the other law societies are dealing with jurisdictions in which Indigenous persons are not the majority. And so it's very easy for them to ignore the place that Indigenous persons have in their legal community, as well as ignoring the importance of addressing things like the impact of residential schools. In Nunavut, it's not possible. You will not be able to be an effective lawyer in any field that you're practicing in this territory if you are completely ignoring this legacy and trying to ignore the Indigenous community. I mean, we have a population of 85% Indigenous. And so we're in a unique situation. It gives us the advantage, too, that we have access to a wealth of knowledge and a lot of individuals who can help assist in creating this kind of programming. But I think that one of our main challenges really is that we don't see a reflection in our law society's membership of the Indigenous community in the way that we should. The amount of Inuit lawyers specifically that are practicing in the territory is very low, and it's much lower than it should be. But we have done some good work to try and address this as well, and I'm sure everyone on the call is familiar with the Nunavut Law Program, which was really a great resource that we had. It occurred in 2 years. It would have been incredible if it could occur every year, I think. But I think you'd be happy to know that at the symposium, I actually, as the representative from Nunavut, was not the person who raised this. We had someone in the audience raise it. When we were having this discussion on mandating legal education, on how we can change legal education across the country, we had individuals from the audience who are not from Nunavut get up and say, the way the Nunavut law program was ran is the way that all of us need to be running our law programs. And for those of you who aren't as familiar with that, there was really a lot of focus on IQ built into the program. There were elders that were part of programs. There were IQ days done constantly. People would go out on the land and learn from each other. And of course, we had a lot of Inuit persons that were able to. Sorry, just reading the comment. Law program should be all Inuit next time. I think that is something that is a problem. Is we do want more Inuit to be in the law program, and we do need to find a way to have more Inuit represented in these spaces. And so Nunavut has done this better than our other jurisdictions, but it still needs to be done even better here as well, which is something that we need to think about moving forward, especially because the law program was something that ran twice, but it hasn't run again, and we don't yet have clear plans for it to run again. So moving forward, I know there's a lot of money has been invested in plans to build a higher education institute in Nunavut. Is that something that we're going to see there? Some sort of law program, one that's specifically geared towards Inuit and to having more Inuit join the legal community? I would hope so, but it's something. I think we can't be complacent about this. We can't just hope that because of the way our jurisdiction is and because we have such a large Inuit presence here that it'll automatically happen. It's something we need to be really actively working towards. And so one of the other themes that came up a lot was collaboration. I think that especially in Nunavut, oftentimes we're operating, and I'm well aware that a lot of those of people who are on the call right now and members of our membership are not resident in Nunavut. But still, as a law society, as a legal community, we tend to operate in a little bit of a silo sometimes. And oftentimes that's with good reason. The way everything operates here can be completely different from other jurisdictions. You know, the communities are completely different. We're dealing with issues just running court circuits that other communities have never had to deal with. and the rules of the court even are different in some ways. And so it makes sense that oftentimes we don't reach out to other jurisdictions and we don't work collaboratively with other jurisdictions. But it's important to recognize that this work specifically that we're trying to do, there's lots of individuals across the country that are trying to do it as well. And so we need to lean a bit more on those supports. And also within our law society, within our community, we need to work across. We have, I'm here as a representative of the Law Society of Nunavut, but of course I'm a practitioner as well. Oftentimes we have the Law Society, the practitioners, and the academics working all separately within their own communities. And so greater collaboration across the types of lawyers that we have, but also across the country is something that's really important. We also have to be aware of what's happening in other jurisdictions. It was Justice Murray St. Clair who mentioned before that it's important for Indigenous persons especially to understand what is being taught about them and their communities in other spaces. And so this is something that can be a bit tricky, I recognize, and I'll talk about this a bit later when I talk some more about barriers. But we need to, Inuit specifically are oftentimes left out of conversations that are happening across the country when we're talking about Indigenous rights, Indigenous learning, the place of Indigenous lawyers. The focus is very often on First Nations and on Métis. And so we need to do more work to go out into these spaces. We also need to work with some of the other Indigenous communities across the country to see what's been working well for them so that we're better able to adopt it for ourselves. Law schools have been making a lot of changes to their curriculum. I think that's one of the places in which we're seeing a lot of progress and a lot of work being done on this. One really great initiative was at Dalhousie University. It was called the IB&M program, and it specifically targeted Indigenous, Black, and Mi'kmaq. And the focus of the program was on recognizing that there's barriers at every step of the process to persons of color, but specifically to a greater extent for Indigenous and Black students and lawyers. And so it works by targeting them from a younger age. So from high school, students will be mentored by the law program and by legal professionals. And this mentoring doesn't end at any stage. It goes all the way through into articling. And there's even a waiver of fees of articling for individuals participating through this program. Personally, that's something I think that we really need to be looking at a bit more in our territory. The graduation rates for high school in our territory are very low. For Inuit, I believe they're about 20%. And so a lot of times when we're talking about things that we can do to try and have more Inuit be educated at law schools, more Inuit lawyers, we're not addressing things at the root cause. And so if students are already being failed at the elementary school level, at the high school level, when we try and step in at this stage, it's already a little bit too late. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities for us as a law society, but also for all of you as practitioners to be a bit more active in our communities and a bit more active in collaborating with not just legal practitioners and legal persons, people who are working in education across the space, people who are in communities. Elders are an invaluable resource and really something that we have access to that a lot of communities do not. And when you speak to the elders of different communities, they're able to identify for you a lot of the barriers. And so I think that's something that we really need to consider a bit more going forward. Call to action 27 and 28, they're really interpreted as the importance of educating lawyers and legal professionals on Indigenous rights, Indigenous history, and Indigenous issues. But I think an even more important part of that is that we need to have more Indigenous lawyers. And that's something that's often forgotten. And so this is a conversation that I really hope today we can of course, it's been happening in our law society and across the territory already, but we can really kind of bring a bit more awareness to and keep going, because it's something that we need to work on more as a community on how do we change the demographics of our law society membership so they're more reflective of the community. And in doing this, something that we need to be mindful of is the fact that, of course, as I just said, Indigenous persons are a great resource for this, and it's great to speak to Indigenous lawyers, Indigenous law students to find out the types of barriers they've been facing. But we also can't put all of the work onto Indigenous individuals. It's important that they're included in the discussion, that they're allowed to lead these discussions where they desire to do so. But in recognizing that there are more barriers facing Indigenous persons, we also have to be mindful of what we can do to ease those barriers. And so it's not always appropriate for us to say, we recognize things are harder for you. Explain to us exactly how they're harder for us. Okay, now also help us fix them. And so it's something we really need to be mindful of. There's a balance there to be struck. And that's something we have to figure out moving forward, how we can do that. Finally, is some of the gaps and challenges that we're facing. And I have it up there at the bottom, the biggest one, kind of the elephant in the room, systemic barriers and racism. Interestingly, there was a challenge on the second day of the symposium that racism, the word racism specifically, had not yet come up to that point. And it was something that people were kind of dancing around. People don't want to call out racism, they don't want to call out systemic barriers. I mentioned this earlier on when we were talking about mandating courses, that it's very easy to approach these discussions from a place of thinking that we're all on the same page, that we all want to do this work together, and that we all want to move forward. Unfortunately, that's not the case, especially when it comes to the legal community. There's countless studies, tons of anecdotal evidence out there, unfortunately, that shows that the legal community is not just reflective of the racism in our society, it's often worse. People who are persons of color, and especially people who are Indigenous or who are Black, women, people who identify differently in any way, will face extra barriers in being successful in a legal career. And so we have to consider how that affects individuals at every part of their journey. Something that came up a lot in our discussions with the law societies is that Indigenous applicants to law societies face lower success rates at every stage of their legal career and their journey. So starting from law schools, when we come to success rates in courses, graduation rates, and then when we're talking about any kind of bar admission courses, it's unfortunately always lower for Indigenous students where it's tracked. And then in a lot of places, it's not tracked at all. And so we have no information on what's happening, which really impedes any ability to address issues. This is somewhere where I do think that Nunavut has been a bit more successful than some other jurisdictions. And it's something I presented on at the symposium as well, where we really reflected on the ways in which our bar program was serving as a barrier to Indigenous students specifically. And as a result of that, when we came out with our statutes exam in Nuktitut, we were the first and only, to this day, jurisdiction across the country that offered a bar admission exam in an Indigenous language, which is a very small and very important barrier to address. And then we didn't stop there, which is, again, very important. We can't just bring in one solution and assume that the work is done and walk away from it. We did another reflection on it. We did a survey. We spoke to the students. We looked into it. And we realized that the statutes exam was serving as a barrier in general to students. And so we removed the statutes exam. We brought in the CPLED program. And again, one step further, with the CPLED program, we have recognized that that's something that's also been challenging to students and been a barrier as well. And so we have now created a remedial program that allows students to work collaboratively with another individual, and it brings in a bit more of Indigenous methods of teaching and learning. It's not just focused on Western systems of testing, which is really important. But one thing that we're really failing on here, and I will say it's that we're failing on across the country, that came up a lot in our discussions, is Indigenous legal orders. So a lot of jurisdictions, a lot of law societies, a lot of law schools are doing a great job about teaching about general the Indigenous way of life, barriers and racism, the legacy of colonialism. But something that's really left out of the conversation a lot is Indigenous legal orders. Every Indigenous community in Canada had a legal order in place before colonialism, before the Canadian legal system came into place. And we really are struggling both with awareness around this and with teaching it. I would say that this is the only issue that came up across the 2-day symposium where there was not a single law society, law school, or practitioner present that had done work to teach Indigenous legal orders to their colleagues, to their students. So this is something that was a takeaway that we all said we need to do better work to educate ourselves on Indigenous legal orders and to make sure that our communities are educated on them as well. There's a few other barriers that come up when we're discussing this. The one is that a lot of these discussions that we're having can be very triggering. And so when we're talking about bringing Inuit lawyers, Inuit law students into these discussions, and as I mentioned before, the importance of finding out what other jurisdictions are speaking about our community, what they're saying about communities in Nunavut, we also have to acknowledge the fact that this can be not just extra work for Indigenous persons, it can be very triggering for Indigenous persons. Something that's been reported to us quite a few times is that when Inuit students or lawyers access programming outside of Nunavut, it very often does not correctly identify things about Inuit and about Inuit communities. And so lawyers and students are put in this awkward situation of wondering if it's their responsibility to correct the materials, and also just a discomfort with realizing that you're kind of being left out of the conversation. And so I think this is a great spot in which non-Indigenous lawyers, non-Indigenous law students can assist as an ally, because it's again, as I was mentioning before, where we don't want to be overly relying on Indigenous persons to be doing this work and to be bringing these conversations forward. It's something that we really need to be assisting with and be cognizant of. Something else that comes up a lot too is that we really are coming from a place of a lack of trust oftentimes with Indigenous communities. Rightfully so, when you look at the legacy of colonialism and you look at a lot of the roles that lawyers in the legal community have unfortunately played in maintaining systems of colonialism. And so something we need to focus on going forward as well is that we're not starting from a place of zero and moving upwards. We're starting almost kind of in the negative. And we really need to regain trust. We need to build trust with Indigenous communities. We need to be aware of historical traumas. Something that we talked about a bit was, and a resource that I would encourage people to look into, is there's a Black Nova Scotian lawyer by the name of Douglas Ruck, and he wrote a great report that contains some recommendations called Regaining Trust. And that's been accepted by the Nova Scotia Barristers Society. They've accepted the recommendations and are working towards them. And he really talked a lot about the ways in which Black and Indigenous persons are coming from a place of lower trust when it comes to legal community, and how this affects not just interactions with lawyers from people in the community who are not lawyers, but also the way that Black and Indigenous persons feel at every stage of their career. And so I won't get too much into it, but we talked about at the symposium about the way that it creates issues around career success. Of course, that's something that we talk about a lot. There can be discomfort in workplaces. It can have a negative impact on mental health. It can push people to leave the profession. But something else that was interesting that came out is that it also really impacts your success in court. Unfortunately, lawyers who are not white are less likely to be successful in court as their white colleagues. And this is something that we have quite a bit of evidence that we've tracked quite a bit. And so the recommendations, they're really great and something that we should be looking at as well. One of the things that came out of it was the importance of culturally competent therapy services. And that's something that we really do need to be having in Nunavut too, I think. Another challenge that we have in Nunavut, of course, that a lot of the other jurisdictions don't have is because we're a smaller law society, because we're a smaller legal community, we also have limited resources. But I don't think that that's something that necessarily needs to hold us back. I think it's something we can work around. And I do note that someone mentioned that, yes, of course, legal orders were stolen by colonizers, and Indigenous persons need to be given support to refine the legal orders before we start teaching and taking it away. Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to, and I think this is again a spot where collaboration and conversations are really important, because we need to understand what's the best way that we can support the community in doing that. Is that something specifically when we're looking at the Inuit community in Nunavut? Is that something where we don't want the law society and legal professionals involved at all at this point? Or is it something where we want them involved to some extent? We want those conversations to be ongoing. I think there's a lot of room for collaboration there, and that's something we should be considering moving forward. It's important in trying to understand a community and understanding how best to serve a community. It's important to understand how historically things would have been resolved in those communities, and we see that with the way that the glad do principles have been adopted across the country, where these things need to be taken into consideration in sentencing. But it's something that really needs to go forward further, especially in Nunavut, especially when we're going into small communities across the territory. So that's really it for what I want to share with you today in terms of presentation specifically. There were a lot of takeaways from the symposium. It was a really incredible experience. And I think that the most important part of it was just that this conversation was happening. We really are kind of moving forward. For a lot of legal professionals as well, you kind of get caught up in your day-to-day practice and you're not focusing as much on these conversations. But especially since the TRC came out, a lot of people read the TRC, read the recommendations, had them back of mind, and then haven't really been checking in to see, is this work being done? Is it being done appropriately? Is there something that we can do differently? And so I think the symposium was a great starting point for a conversation. I think things like this today, where we're all gathered here and we can have conversations, are a great starting point as well. And so on that note, I would encourage anyone in the chat that has something that they would like to share, questions for me, but even just things that they want to pose to the group in general, please raise your hand, unmute yourself, start speaking. Anyone that would have anything they'd like to share.
Where do you raise your hand? I don't see it.
Oh, that's fine. You can just speak as well.
Goeiemiddag. Paulo Click. I'm encouraged by the progress that's being made, especially in the law school where they're committing to mandatory teachings. I'm still a bit puzzled by no real programs for practicing lawyers in our territory, considering that 85% of the population is Indigenous. And a lot of these lawyers become judges in our territory, and they haven't really mixed in with our population. So there's something missing there that I feel that needs to be addressed. And if there's any plans to introduce and commit to implementing the recommendation to teach practitioners in our territory about us.
Thank you, Koyanami. It is something we're having as a law society. We're trying to figure out right now what's the best way to implement some kind of course or some kind of teachings that we can share with the practitioners that are a member of the Nunavut Law Society. But I do think you're touching on something else there, which is really important, which is, unfortunately, again, we take for granted, and I think individuals outside of Nunavut looking at us have a different understanding of the picture as well. We take for granted that just by virtue of the fact that 85% of our population is Inuit, that means that individuals who are living in Nunavut or who are practicing in Nunavut are interacting with individuals that are Inuit, that are a part of the communities, that are learning, that are understanding. And unfortunately, very often that's not the case. You're right that people will come, they will work. The majority of their colleagues are not Inuit either. They won't make effort to learn about IQ or to participate in things like IQ days or those kinds of offerings. And I think that's really where we get to the importance of mandating these kinds of courses, because we have in the past offered things optionally. And I know a lot of the workplaces do. I work for the government of Nunavut, the GN, and that's something that we've offered as well, is optional courses. But the same sorts of people that are not interested in learning anything about Indigenous communities or Inuit when they're living in the community are not people who are going to reach out and take these courses. And so I think that is why mandating is so important, why mandating can't be something that's optional. Anyone else have anything they want to share? Anything, even any thoughts that kind of came up as you were hearing this? Jessica?
Courses are great, but I also think it's important that they're Indigenous led. My concern, and I am one of the Nunavut Law Program grads, my concern in completing CPLED is it was really clear that it was written by people who had no idea, no understanding, and particularly the Indigenous model was offensive at best. So I think, again, that it's important that it is developed by Indigenous experts and that it doesn't pay lip service to such an important topic.
Yeah, that is something that I'd heard quite a bit. And actually, the person who helped develop the CPLED programming for Nunavut was at this symposium, and so I had some conversations with them as well around this. And shockingly, they had no awareness that the things they developed were not culturally appropriate or that did not properly speak to the situation in Nunavut. So I think you're right. It's something that needs to be, as much as I talked about collaboration and relying on other jurisdictions, there are situations like this in which things really need to be being done in the territory by those of us in the territory for the territory, and especially Indigenous persons. I still do struggle a little bit around how this, of course, when we're developing it, if we have individuals that come forward that are excited about doing this work, Inuit lawyers, I mean specifically, that are excited about doing this work, that want to do it, that want to help out, that want to develop it, that's great. If we don't have that as much, I think I struggle a bit with how do we address this issue that I identified before, where we're placing too much on Indigenous lawyers and Indigenous students, and we're asking too much for them to do too much of the work. Is there space for it to be developed by those of us who are non-Inuit, and then to have things be run by Indigenous lawyers, Indigenous law students, elders? I really don't know what the answer is specifically. And again, anyone in the group whose thoughts on that, I'd be happy to hear. Mandy?
Kuya Namik also for this. Thank you to everybody else for making their comments. So I've been practicing now for 17 years, I think. I don't know. It's been a while. I graduated from the University of Manitoba and was and did all my articling down in the PA and was called to the bar of Manitoba down there before I moved back home to Nunavut. And I actually was very surprised because they did the Manitoba Law Society did a CPLED program down there, and I was actually quite surprised that Nunavut decided to do a CPLED program for this last or start a CPLED program, because the way I remembered a CPLED program was something that I was like, I don't know if that'll really work. because it was very Kablunak, I think. And just, I was in the PA, which is about 6 hours or 7 hours from Winnipeg. And I would, have to drive down to Winnipeg because 17 years ago we didn't really have good internet in the PA in northern Manitoba. And, you'd have to go to classes with, my articling buddies or the other articling students. And you'd sit in class and you'd take your tests and you'd have to pass them to move on, type of thing. And I just thought, that's probably not the best way to do this type of articling program for Inuit. One, because it's probably best to, well, I don't know if that's the way you're going to do it, is classes and then, articling with people, and then having to quickly go through learning something in a weekend. Just, I find that people just don't have that type of stamina or mindset, you know. Especially in Nunavut and the north. It's just not that type of thing. And I was just very, very surprised that CPLED was going to be used. And, I've found also that I've had people now going through this last this thing that you've created, contacting me and saying, "Hey, Mandy, have you written an opinion before?" Like, yeah. They're like, "Can you give me some sort of just a template?" So, because they don't even know what an opinion is, and so I give them like a page, saying, "Okay, this is what you do. You put your name, you put a whatever." I don't give them any information. I don't write them an opinion, but just the template, where they put things. Something that I would assume they would learn, at least through CPLED. So it was just a interesting thing, that I thought would, I was like, that's very colonial, very Kabnunak. And I hadn't been involved with the Law Society or its things because I was living in the Northwest Territories when that was all happening. So I decided that I would get more involved with Law Society stuff again this year, see if I could help out a bit. But and then, I helped with the IJS negotiations and stuff for the government, the Indigenous Justice Strategy. And I found also that when we were in our negotiations with people, that they were very, very worried that, like I mentioned here, that Indigenous traditions and stuff like that, they didn't understand them, and they were tired of being pushed, by people saying, "Okay, we want to get them going. We want to start your Indigenous legal systems. We want to start making sure that they start being recognized." And they were like, "But we don't know what they are. We have to stop being pushed on learning them. We want to be able to do it, Kablunoks." Well, I'm using Kablunoks, but white people have made us do things so much, that let us at least learn these things. And I think we need to start understanding that Indigenous people have to be given that respect instead of saying, we have to start understanding that Indigenous traditional orders existed, and we need to start, teaching them or doing these things. We have to also understand that we're still going through reconciliation, and we're still doing all these things, and that's going to take some time. So we need to work with our Indigenous partners and Inuit and all those people, and make sure that it's done properly. So
Pandemic, thank you for that. Yeah, I think maybe even when we talk about the fact that we've, I mentioned across the country, nobody is really doing great work on teaching Indigenous legal orders. What you're identifying right now, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we're not yet at the point in which that's what we need to be teaching. What we need to be teaching right now is just general awareness that legal orders existed and that work is being done to reconnect with those, to understand those. Maybe it's not something that's ready for consumption of non-Indigenous persons yet, and that's okay. In terms of the CPLED, I think you're right. It's really challenging in general when we're looking at anything to do with legal education and the legal community, that the legal community is a very colonial system. You know, the lawyers, courts, these were the tools of colonialists, right? These were the things that were used to uphold colonial systems of power. And so when we're looking at trying to make space for people who were the victims of colonial systems within these communities, it's very tricky. And I agree with you that the CPLED course, as I've understood it, is probably not the best way to be helping Indigenous persons enter the legal community. But the statutes exam, I think, was probably even worse. I do think that the remedial program is something really great. You mentioned a bit the student reaching out to you and you assisting them in understanding what opinion looks like. And I think that's something that is really important in the Inuit community, is that mentorship and working with others in our communities is something that's already done. And so the way the remedial program is working right now, it's recognizing that, it's adopting that as a part of it, which I think is definitely a step forward in the right direction. So there's the CPLED, of course, was CPLED and the statutes exam together, which of course is another reason I think that that system was not great, because it's just such a massive onerous task for law applicants to be doing both the CPLED course and the statutes exam. I think Jessica did raise a good point in the chat that when we're talking about helping or asking for help from community in developing programming moving forward, compensation is something that we should be thinking about. Bonnie's asking a great question, in that would support look like making spaces and resources available to research, discover, and reconnect with Indigenous legal orders? And that's something I would put to the group, that when we talk about supporting connecting and understanding these Indigenous legal orders, is that something that the Law Society and the legal practitioners who are non-Indigenous should be just completely standing aside from? Or would it be helpful to be assisting in making resources available and in creating spaces for that work to be done? I pose that to the group because I don't think I'm the right person to be answering that question. But if no one has the answer today, maybe something that we can think about even.
At the end of the day, I don't believe that the Law Society should, or the legal profession should be providing resources. It probably should go to the governments to work on that reconciliation with them, and to help provide them the self-determination that Indigenous people should be given, and help them to move on to do that. Perhaps it should be provided in that way.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Is there anything else that anyone that came up while we were talking for anyone, or that anyone wants to address, or any other questions about the symposium specifically? No, I guess that's it. Then on that note, I think I'll close this off. We're coming to the end of our hour as well. I really want to thank you all for being here today. I think this is such an important topic. I was very excited to attend the symposium, and I was so excited to discuss this with all of you as well today. It's something that I want to discuss moving forward with even more members of our Law Society. And I really mean so much to have it's like much bigger turnout than I expected. It really means so much to have so many of you present for these conversations. It's just a recognition of how important this is to our community and how much work there needs to be done to move forward on this. And to that end, I threw up my contact information before, but I'll put it in the chat as well. If anyone wants to have further conversations about this, they have other thoughts and things that they weren't necessarily feel as comfortable sharing with the group, or things come up later on as you're reflecting on what we discussed today, please reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you again. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and incredible rest of your week, and yeah, thanks.
Siguiendo me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shanze.
Thank you.